You can't change how you were parented, but you can change the narrative that you choose to believe as a result of it. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Soul Work podcast with myself, Alexis Lee. Over here we are about prioritizing what matters the most, but unfortunately is often overlooked, and that is the soul work. The soul work is made evident in our character as well as our choices. It's vital, it's essential, but over here we do the soul work together. On this episode, I really wanted to speak to us about a concept that I use often in therapy, and it is the idea of reparenting, self-reparenting to be precise, as well as inner child work. I feel as though there's a lot of psychoeducation, maybe some pop psychology around inner child work, but I thought it might be really, really good for you to see how I use it in therapy, how you can use it in your everyday life, and understand the importance of it. So when it comes to self-reparenting, we first start with the idea that we have the license to provide for ourselves the nurture, the care, the understanding that we needed as a child and we still need right now. Especially when it involves addressing unresolved childhood issues, childhood traumas, childhood emotions and experiences. The goal of self-reparenting is to reach this place of wholeness and reach a place of healing. I find this particularly insightful because some of the wounds that I find that we incur in our childhood often have to do with how we were parented, how we were raised, what we received and what we didn't receive. The emotional needs that were met, the emotional needs that weren't met, the physical needs that weren't met. And so this is something that I come back to often. You can't change how you were parented, but you can change the narrative that you choose to believe as a result of it. For me, inner child work accompanies this very, very well. And like I said, I'm going to show you some of the things that I do to work with the inner child. It accompanies the idea of self-reparenting very, very well, because the idea is that within every single one of us is the inner child. Our soul has experienced every part of our life with us, right? So how we speak about ourselves, how we speak to ourselves, isn't just us speaking to ourselves in this moment, but it's also speaking to every version of ourselves. And oftentimes the healing work is going back and looking at how you were handled, or how you handled yourself at age 12, at age 10, or whenever that pivotal moment was, or those pivotal moments were, and being able to go back to them and say, what do I wish happened? How can I change the narrative? How can I author a different story? The presence of an active inner child is seen in our emotional triggers. There's a term that we call arrested development, which essentially is when we stop growing at a particular age where a trauma or an incident occurs, right? So if your parents split when you were, let's say, age 12, sometimes you can have arrested development, which means that actually within you, you're kind of locked at the maturity of age 12. If you experience a severe abuse when you were age 7, sometimes there can be an arrested development that takes place around that age. I find it very, very pivotal as a therapist to go back into those stories, go back into those memories, and actually look at ways in which we can find deeper healing that can affect how you interact today. One type of the inner child work that I love to do is once we have had a few sessions of therapy and I'm able to understand the story of my client a bit better, we're able to explore some of the pertinent memories that they still have and the wounding events that they've experienced. I then say, okay, so let's go back into those memories. I hope this doesn't sound too spooky, but essentially we are just using the imagination, and God gave us imaginations for a reason. I find it quite strange sometimes when people have such an adverse view on using your imagination for good, when oftentimes we use our imaginations quite naturally and intentionally negatively. We use our imaginations to worry. We use our imaginations to catastrophize. We use our imagination to think of the worst case scenario. We use our imagination to compound the issues that we're currently experiencing. So why can't we use those same imagination, that same mechanism to reauthor something that's more beneficial to you? to think the best, to believe the best, to change the narrative that you had grown to believe. There's a branch of systemic therapy that I really, really love called narrative therapy. And the essence of that kind of therapy, which is something that I also use in therapy, I'm an integrative therapist, so I use different modalities. I'm trained in different modalities. But within narrative therapy, the idea is that the therapist is essentially panning for gold as they're listening to you. They're panning for gold. They're looking out for the core beliefs, the inner vows, the inner commitments that the client has made to a story or to a narrative. And then the therapist is thinking, what alternative narrative can be used to replace the dominant narrative that they've believed all their life? Simple example, a child whose parents split when they were age 10. And all they remember before the age of 10 is this idea of feeling helpless as they experienced domestic violence within the home. And so the dominant narrative that they believed was one of helplessness, was one of powerlessness, was one of being unloved, being unwanted, or whatever the case might be. That dominant narrative has now shaded and changed how they view themselves as a person. In the process of panning for gold as a therapist, what you're looking for is what else was happening before the age of 10? Well, before the age of 10, you most likely were in school. How was school? How did you find your school life? What else was going on at school? You then come to find out, for instance, that the client was doing really, really well academically. So even though things were really, really terrible at home, at school, it felt like a safe place. Well, then we are essentially zoning in on the alternative narrative and lessening the influence and the dominance of the dominant narrative that they've believed. Is it possible that whilst you felt helpless and you felt powerless, you were in control, you were a bright student, you had a sense of direction and purposefulness that pushed you and propelled you in your academics? Wow. Considering what you were going through at home, for you to be able to also be having a great social life or academic life, it shows that you are more strong than you've actually believed that you are. That's just an example of narrative therapy and one of the ways in which we can work with the inner child. One of the key coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms that I often see people go to is this way of cutting themselves off from everything negative about them before a certain age. So for example, if my childhood was riddled with abuse and feeling unwanted or neglect or feeling helpless, well, as an adult, I no longer feel this way. Thus, everything before the age of 18 or whatever age, I'm going to completely separate myself from it. And I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to pay it any mind. I don't like that person. I'm no longer that person. And it might sound like it's quite intuitive, but it actually is counterintuitive. We don't heal by rejecting ourselves. We heal by accepting the person that we needed to be or the person that we became because of the situations that were around us. We accept that person. We love that person. We appreciate that person while seeking to make active changes in our everyday life. So perhaps you were the timid 16-year-old. Perhaps you were the angry 15-year-old. Perhaps you were the upset and insecure 13-year-old. These are all things that you've experienced, and rather than cutting yourself off from that, it's about integrating it into your story today. There's this quote that I heard once, and I hope I don't misquote it, but it essentially says, to heal the wound, you have to get to the root and kiss it all the way up. That there's something significant about acknowledging how you were shaped by your trauma, but choosing not to, as an adult, stay in that place of being traumatized. So back to self-reparenting. All of us in some ways are parenting ourselves. We're encouraging ourselves or criticizing ourselves in one way or another. I've heard it said before that your inner voice is oftentimes the voice of a dominant caregiver when you were young. So if you find that you are hypercritical, or if you find that you are extra empathetic towards yourself, it's very likely that the people in your life, the people in authority in your life, were either critical or empathetic towards you. Whatever the case might be, you can begin to change and work on that inner voice through self-reparenting. And it looks like just being cognizant of the words that you speak over yourself, cognizant of the ways in which you treat yourselves, the boundaries that you place around your heart, and that includes your affection, your attention, the boundaries that you place around your time, for example. These are ways in which we learn to self-reparent. There are certain conversations that some of us wish we had with a parent when we were younger, and you get to, in some ways, have that conversation with yourself. And I'll give you an example of this. One of the exercises that I sometimes do with my clients is that we do some memory work. So we locate a memory, and this would be a traumatic memory of something that's happened. Honestly, the majority of my caseload, 2/3 of my caseload represents people that have experienced sexual abuse. So when working with a particular memory, I will have my client share with me exactly what happened, fill in all the details as best as they know. And it's okay if you don't know all the details, because truthfully, when it comes to traumatic memories, particularly the ones when we were children, we experience something called repression, which is when our psyche, our mind, chooses to unconsciously suppress what's happened. And so oftentimes there's big gaps in memories, big chunks where you can't remember what happened or how this moved from here to here, and that's absolutely fine as well. We fill in the gaps. So let's use an example. We'll use Sally as an example. So if I have Sally in the counseling room, and let's say Sally is age 30, but Sally experienced molestation at the age of 13. What we might do is have Sally at 30 have a conversation with Sally at age 13. So we will go back into the memory, and I'll have Sally at age 30 with her eyes closed, watching the scene play out, and I will narrate the scene to the best of my ability according to the details that I've been provided. And I will say, let's freeze the frame. So the act has happened, different things have happened. Sally at 30, you get to have a conversation with Sally at age 13. What do you say to her in this moment? And then we might freeze the frame. And I try to be very discerning with how I handle these memories. Sometimes I stop at different points in the actual scene to kind of get my client's take on what they're feeling, what they're perceiving. But eventually I will have Sally at 30, sit with Sally at 13 and debrief with her. Because oftentimes after abuse, a lot of us don't have space to debrief. Some people don't share it with an adult. They don't, immediately have someone to say, this is what's happened, what do I do about this? Oftentimes there's a narrative that is formed purely in the mind of the person that is abused, because they don't have an added perspective from an adult in the moment. So I have Sally at 30, have a conversation with Sally at 13. And this conversation is often very, very pivotal. Number one, because it shows me as a therapist the areas where they need to grow in their self-reparenting. But number two, and I think more importantly, it gives the client a sense of closure. They get that debrief conversation, a sense of closure to realize that what just happened wasn't your fault and that you didn't deserve that, which are oftentimes the very things that people who have been a victim of abuse struggle to believe. They struggle to believe that it wasn't their fault, and they struggle to believe that they didn't deserve what happened to them. Another aspect that I use, especially as a Christian in therapy, if I have Christian clients that are open to the faith element, is I use a tool and a technique called God in the Room. And so I might say to them at that moment where the molestation is happening, for example, where is God right now? What's God thinking whilst he's watching this? What's on God's heart? What might God be saying to you in this moment? And this activity is another key aspect of this inner child work that often unlocks the empathy of God towards my client. So many times we place on God the voice of an authority figure, and oftentimes not one that is compassionate or empathetic, perhaps one that will blame you for what you've done. And so I see very, very clearly and visibly in the therapy room how a client can move from a place of God is so disappointed in me to God is not happy that this is happening. This breaks the heart of God. A scenario that I had with a client, and I won't share too many details, but similar to what I'm describing with Sally, but more aggressive. And I asked her, whilst this was happening, where is God right now? And my client said to me, he's right there in front of me weeping. And I felt that chills all through my body because that's the imagery that we have of God. I heard it said once that God weeps first, and he does. That his heart is truly broken when we experience that kind of abuse, particularly at a young age. The Bible talks about if any one of you causes a little one to stumble, it would be better to tie a millstone like an anchor around your neck and jump into an ocean than to cause a little one to stumble. And oftentimes these stories of abuse and molestation, they begin the path of sexual perversion. It begins the path of lawlessness, struggles with emotional health and mental health, and the list is honestly endless. It is causing a little one to stumble. And God's heart is so deeply moved and grieved when it happens. So inner child work is a powerful way of addressing what has happened in the past. We can't go back to the past and physically change what happened, but we can change our perspective on what has happened because our perspective is multi-layered. And oftentimes what we know of the situation is not all that exists of the situation. So I want to talk about one of the tools that I think is important in nurturing yourselves. I often talk about journaling, self-compassion, boundary setting. All of those things are important, but they all come from a place of safety. I think when we have safety, or when we learn to nurture safety around us, we are essentially enabling ourselves to thrive, enabling ourselves to become the fullness of what God has for us. One thing about trauma is that trauma teaches us that we are unsafe. And even just in how trauma rewires the brain, it essentially teaches us that we're not safe. We get locked into the sympathetic response, which is fight and flight. Our amygdala, a part of our limbic system, is constantly firing, letting us know that we're not safe. And it's very easy for what happened when you were young to still be causing you to feel unsafe. You feel unsafe in your body. You feel disconnected from your body. You feel unsafe with people of the opposite sex sometimes, or people of the same sex. You feel unsafe around adults or males of a certain age. You feel unsafe with your thoughts. You feel like you can't be alone. Safety is one of the key things that trauma robs from us. And so a key way in which we can nurture ourselves is to actively create safety for us. There are 4 types of safety that I believe that we can nurture and should nurture. And the first kind of safety is internal safety. Internal safety, and arguably it's probably one of the hardest ones to create. If trauma has made you look at your body or look at yourself in a certain kind of way, being able to rewrite that can be very, very difficult. But it's learning to love your body. It's learning to love your mind. It's learning to really appreciate what it has taken to become the person that you are. The grit, the white knuckling, whatever it's looked like to become the person that you are, it's being able to appreciate that. Like I said with the quote, it's kissing the wound from the root all the way to the top. And so for yourself, it looks like the ability to sit in silence, sit with your thoughts, sit knowing that you have value, sit knowing that you have worth. And this is probably the key area that I spend a lot of time on in therapy. So if you're really struggling with this, I think getting yourself a therapist that is able to work in a person-centered way could be really, really good for you in addressing the issue of internal safety. If you don't feel safe with yourself, it's going to be really hard to feel safe in the other 3 areas that I'm about to mention. The second level of safety that I talk about is this spiritual safety, the safety where it's me and it's God. And this is particularly relevant to those of us who are Christians. The space that the Holy Spirit inhabits within us needs to feel like a safe space. I kind of liken it to the tabernacle that was built. We had the holies of holies, then you had the inner court, the outer court, and outside. And the holies of holies was the place that only the high priest could come and dwell. And the high priest is a foreshadowing of who Jesus is. He is the high priest that empathizes with us in our weakness. And so that space is such a set apart space that you spend with God, and it's really important to develop a sense of safety there, a sense of relaxedness. And that only comes from really being able to see God for who He really is. If you have an image of God in your trauma or in the things that you've been through that is not consistent with who He says He is, it's going to be really hard for you to develop that safe space. If you've experienced spiritual abuse or someone twisting and thwarting the word of God, it might be really hard for you to inhabit that safe space with God. But it is very, very important to your growth, as from that place, from that safe space with God, not only do we see Him for who He is, but we also see ourselves for who we are. God gives us that sense of purpose, that sense of meaning, why we're here, where we're going, the value and the worth that we have is anchored in who He is as a person. And so if you're struggling in this area, I think definitely Christian therapy, but also pastoral care, reading books around this area, watching sermons around this area, around the love of God, and realizing that it's because God so loved the world that He sent His beloved Son to die for us, so that whosoever believes in Him will not perish, but have everlasting life. He loves you. He cares about you. And even in the things that we've spoken about, whether that's neglect and abandonment to maltreatment to abuse, God is the Father that will never leave you nor forsake you. And He Himself, as a Father, reparents us. And this is kind of an episode for another day, but there's self-reparenting and then there's God reparenting. And it is so sweet when you allow the voice of God to be the affirmation that you need every single day, where you walk with the understanding and the knowledge that He is with us, interpreting, giving us perspective on the things that we have walked through and the things that we will walk through. Thirdly is relational safety. It's really important to feel that sense of safety in the friendships that we keep, right? Not just friendships, but also family. Having people in our lives that genuinely love us, right? And love doesn't just look like coddling or anything like that. Love is truth telling. Love is patient, it's kind. I was about to define love, but I'm like, 1 Corinthians 13 does it perfectly, thanks. It doesn't delight in iniquity, it rejoices in the truth, all of those things. Having people that genuinely love you. The wounds that we develop relationally are healed relationally. Thus, it is so important for us to be in a community and be in a space where we are loved back to life, where we're able to experience pure touch and not perverted touch, where we're able to experience encouragement and exhortation and not just criticism. We don't heal in a vacuum. We don't heal in isolation. We actually heal in community. Lastly, I think the last part of safety is environmental. Our environment plays a huge part in our mental health and in our emotional health, and I don't think we talk about it enough. From air quality to what we're eating to the political climate, the socio-political issues around us or socio-economic issues around us to the kind of job we have, just the environment around us. And one of the things that I'm constantly speaking to my clients about is being radical in cutting out chronic stress. So, you know, the things that keep you up at night, the things that weigh you down, the things that you know you need to work through, whether that's moving house to changing jobs. And I'm not advocating for living a soft, carefree life. No, not necessarily. But there are some things that we can move around in our environment. There's some things that we can change externally, like the food we eat or going for a walk more or moving out of our parents' house to getting a job or changing jobs, whatever those things are that can bring about a greater sense of safety, it's really important that you take that. So in closing, I want you to see inner child work as not something that is a frivolous thing. I mean, I've heard some hot takes on inner child work that have been, sometimes I really grimace and I really cringe when I hear them, because people make it sound like it's, I'm just sitting with my inner child, I'm soothing my inner, just really things that honestly, maybe for some people it represents that, but I certainly know in how I was trained, that's not what inner child work is about. It's just purely the acknowledgement that as I exist, so too does a 10-year-old Iffy. I never mentioned this, but I will also say that one of the things that I find really pivotal is encouraging my client to look at a picture of themselves at that age. Sometimes we struggle to evoke self-compassion for ourselves and the things that we've gone through. And so just being able to look at the innocence in the eyes of yourself at the age of whatever that age was, and being able to look and say, I wish you never went through that. You didn't deserve that. It has set you back in so many ways, but I make the choice to not allow this to hinder the person that you can become and the potential that you can reach. I'm bringing you guys into some of my inner child work that I've had to do, in acknowledging that whilst some of the things that I've gone through have been hurtful, has meant that I've been more predisposed to things like a rejection and hurt. I get to make a choice now as an adult to no longer stay in that place, and to provide myself with the affirmation each and every day that says to me, I'm accepted, I'm loved, I'm cherished. And I get to reparent myself in that way and allow God ultimately to reparent me too. Thank you guys so much for watching. I pray that this episode was an absolute blessing to you. Please share it with a friend, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Lots of love.